Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. And so in today's video, I kind of want to continue on what I talked about in my last video on over-socialized midwittery and why that is a feature of liberal democratic societies and not a bug, okay? And so we need to rewind the clocks a little bit. We need to talk about the English Civil War a little bit. We need to talk about the Civil War between Oliver Cromwell, the different players, Charles II, on the typical fashion of basically top-down dictatorship where you try to get your way through petty power politics, and how consequentially this led to the development of liberal democratic societies, the concepts of rights, rights of the individual as opposed to rights of the king. You can see that transition from the divine right of kings to the, divine right of the individual, God-given rights that's talked about in the American Republic. And so a consequence of the English Civil War was the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679. It's something that people talk about every time some president comes up and everyone's afraid of martial law getting passes. The suspension of the Habeas Corpus Act, which was essentially a consequence of Charles II being a terrible ruler trying to play petty power politics within his kingdom. And so it was passed to restrict the powers of the king from arbitrarily throwing people in jail for literally no reason at all. Is because prior to the liberal democratic conception of rights, or the right to due process and the fact that you can't throw people in jail for any arbitrary reason, kings and monarchs, and people in political power could throw people in jail just because the fact is they didn't like somebody, and that was a very common thing prior to modern liberal democratic republics. And so that begs the question, okay? And like I said earlier, and why I say this over-socialized midwittery is a consequence of liberal democratic republics, it's a feature and not a bug, is because the funny part is that begs the question, how do people exert political power in modern liberal democratic republics as a politician as opposed to a monarch or a nobleman? And that brings a very interesting question, and also on elucidating the social dynamics of modern liberal democratic republics as opposed to monarchies. So it's an axiomatic rule in modern liberal democratic republics that you can't throw somebody in jail for no reason at all, especially with the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679 and the American counterpart, is that, you need a pretense to throw people in jail, okay? And I've talked a lot about over-socialized midwittery and pretensing and all that sorts of stuff, is that the fact is that within liberal democratic societies, you require that pretense. You need that pretext, even if it's a lie, okay? To throw somebody in jail, you need to have this gaslighting pretext to justify why you're throwing them in jail, whether it be a false charge or whatever, right? You need to have some level of political will to justify throwing people in jail. And that's why the politics within liberal democratic republics are all about pretensing. It's always some other pretext charge, is because, they might have criticized the existing powers that be, and then they came up with some, nonsense pretext to throw that dissident in jail. That is the dynamics of liberal democratic republics. That is how people in political power exercise political will over one another within liberal democratic societies. Because of the Habeas Corpus Act, and because the fact is politicians and political leaders within these republics don't have the direct power to throw people in jail just because they don't like them, that is why it is required that they play the pretexting game. They play the gaslight game, and they create lies and, PR campaigns to basically, destroy somebody as a pretense to throw them in jail, or even exclude them from political power entirely, okay? And that's why I say, over-socialized midwittery is a consequence and a feature of liberal democratic societies and not a bug, okay? And so the funny part is, it's interesting how you can talk about how the intentions of a system start out, is because you look at the Fourth Estate. I've criticized it a couple of times in my comment section when it comes to the Fourth Estate, particularly the mainstream media, is originally these things were intended to be the tools of transparency to hold people in political power accountable. That's the whole logic of democracy, is that, there's a level of accountability for people in political power as opposed to monarchs. So, people in political power could basically be held accountable by just simple transparency games, but that's not what happens. What does the mainstream media do? The mainstream media isn't actually used as a tool for, maintaining transparency, but instead basically doles out the best and the worst PR to the hand-picked people they want in political power to begin with. And so the fact is, if you're not a part of the already established elite, the media elite will never allow you near an ounce of powers, because they'll run countless PR smear campaigns against you, is because the fact is they'll come up with a million reasons why you're not fit to hold power, but then they will ultimately turn a blind eye on whose name's client list. All of a sudden, the people associated with that person in power, all of a sudden, they will turn a blind eye to what is said, okay? That is why the Fourth Estate, even though it started out as a good intention within liberal democratic societies to ensure transparency and openness of things, ends up being weaponized by the very same elite to basically manufacture consent for the people they want in political power above all else. You know, at the end of the day, the politicians going in and out of political power are handpicked by the media elite, and they're like batteries, as once they've run their course, serving the policies of this particular elite within political power and these liberal democratic societies, they'll get changed out and replaced with a new set of batteries, which will run their life, you know, originally on popular will policies, but after they've run their life, you know, serving in practice the policies that benefit a particular class at the expense of the vast majority of people, you know, they'll be changed out like a battery, and the cycle continues. Okay? And so the interesting thing I wanted to talk about, and I'll be completing it later in another video, is the concept of the philosopher king in Plato, is because the one thing that you can see with these liberal democratic republics, and the one thing that they fear the most, is a populist leader that's able to overcome these kinds of PR games. Somebody who is blatantly honest, that doesn't really care about the gaslight games that liberal democratic societies, you know, have. You know, some people are good at the PR games, and they know how to basically keep up the smearing and slandering to just double down and continue on with their policies regardless of the gaslight game that the establishment elite would like to play against ordinary people and the outsider politics, okay? Because at the end of the day, like, all the points that I'm giving right now, when I talk about class issues, these are all outsider politics. And what they fear most, essentially, at the end of the day, and a couple of people have pointed out in my comments section, is somebody who's a populist leader that basically garners the political will of the people to achieve the will of the masses. And that's what they fear the most. And why is that? Because the fact is, the reason they fear a populist leader, and it's kind of funny that I gave a whole, like, scathing critique of populists, not populism itself, is that the reason they fear populist leaders, because the fact is when people consciously put their political will behind a singular leader that is capable of achieving what the masses want. You know, this is the entire gaslight game that the establishment likes to play against outsider politicians, is that, you know, it's hard to gaslight, it's hard to psyop people who put their faith in a singular leader. That's why they fear a populist leader, is because the fact is they're afraid, because the fact is if with somebody who has enough support, okay, that there's no amount of psyoping and gaslighting is going to keep them from the helms of political power and taking power for themselves and basically carrying out with the will of the majority. That's why they hate populist leaders, okay? And, you know, I'm saying this kind of after the fact of the last video when I was talking about the determination of the philosopher king, okay? Is because I've said this before, you know, when it comes to elitism and populism, they're not mutually exclusive. Like I said in the last video, I very much talked about how, you know, people don't care whether they live under a liberal democratic system or an absolute monarchy. What they care about is, do they have a fair shot at life, and can they put a roof over their head and feed their families? That's all most people care about. They don't care about deep political theory. They don't care about, you know, whatever, you know, obscure philosopher somebody who is really into politics, you know, likes to talk about. You know, they care about whether or not they can put a roof over their head and feed their families. Okay? And so, at the end of the day, most people wouldn't have a problem living under the rulership of a monarch. And that's the thing that the ruling class does in a sort of sense fear, right? You know, so with that being said, you know, I think I've kind of continued on the point of, like, the oversocialized midwittery of liberal democratic societies. I've kind of shown how this is more or less a feature of the system rather than a bug, is because the fact is everyone's complaining about it now. Everybody is talking about how the soft skills epidemic is taking over the hard skills epidemic. I've talked about it countless in my videos about how you have midwits coming in the comment section saying soft skills are more important than hard skills, right? You know, the reason this culture is dominating in the Republic of word cells and gaslighters is because it's a direct consequence of the system itself. It's a feature and not a bug. With that being said, I think I've made my points in this video. Like I said, I don't think this was going to be a too terribly long video. It's just something I wanted to kind of get my points out, you know, in this video. Very short, very quick, very sweet. So, you know, that being said, I'm going to go ahead and close off the video, and y'all have a nice day.